Near disaster was averted on an SAA flight recently. A passenger flight from Accra to Johannesburg had water in its fuel. This could have been caused both engines to flame out and crash. Now that flight should have been diverted, but it wasn't. For more on this, we are joined by Leitch, the publisher and editor at Flyer magazine. Thank you very much for your time this morning, Guy. Let's maybe start with the details surrounding the water that could have ended up in the fuel on this particular passenger flight. How would something like that happen?
Yeah, hi, good morning and nice to be with you. The water is not, I'm afraid, that uncommon a problem in airliner refueling. It happens, it gets in, water condenses in tanks left overnight, it gets in through rain when the aircraft are washing. So airliners have safety systems in place to check for water. And that's what prevented this flight taking off from Accra in the first place, when they discovered that there was in fact water in the fuel. The big questions are what happened thereafter. What happened to SAA safety systems? What happened to their highly rated safety standards? When they, after 16.5 hours on the ground, while they had supposedly tried to get the water out of the system, they decided that the aircraft was safe to fly. They loaded it up with passengers and crew and took off back to Johannesburg. That was clearly the wrong decision, as evidenced by the engine surging that happened over north of Gaborone. Note that, just to correct things, the aircraft engines didn't flame out. They throttled down. One of them throttled all the way down to idle and couldn't be accelerated again. So the aircraft essentially just limped into Johannesburg pretty much on one engine, with the one engine just at idle. The real questions that need to be asked here is what happened to SAA's supposedly non-negotiable safety standards, that they decided that this aircraft was safe enough to fly, and yet it clearly wasn't, because it had these double engine problems over the desert. And what does it say about, well, I think I also just need to say something about the diversion issue. People have said that the aircraft should have diverted to the nearest airport. The nearest airport was Gaborone. Unfortunately, that wasn't really an option for this particular flight, because there was a huge thunderstorm over Gaborone, and the aircraft was already descending for Johannesburg. So it was okay that it carried on into Johannesburg. The big question is, why did it take off in the first place?
It's very concerning what you've just described, Guy, in that you say it limped into Johannesburg. Who ultimately would be held accountable for making the decision to say that the flight is good to carry passengers back to Johannesburg?
Well, ultimately, it's always the captain's responsibility. Yes, they do carry what we in the industry call a flying spanner, which is a qualified engineer when they fly into remote destinations without full ground support, and Accra is one of those. So they do have an engineer on board. The engineer has to sign the aircraft off. But, you know, it's not a simple matter to get fuel out of an aircraft's tanks, particularly when there's so much. For one thing, there's so many different tanks. It gets into the fuel system. It has to be purged from all the pumps and all the filters. It's a massive undertaking. It took them I think over a month on the ground to get the aircraft back into an airworthy condition. So it is my view that the captain, who is, as I said, is ultimately responsible for signing off the aircraft, for proceeding with the flight, should never have gone ahead with that flight. He put passengers' lives at risk. That is an undeniable assertion by going ahead with the flight. And unfortunately, the captain's got a history of having broken the rules in a number of ways, or committed basic errors of airmanship already. Just a year ago, with the so-called vaccine flight to Brussels, the captain this flight nearly resulted in a huge crash into Boksburg or Kempton Park due to an oversight by the captain. The captain had left SAA. He'd taken a voluntary severance package, a very valuable one, it has to be said, and then he'd been inexplicably returned to SAA to head up standards and training, and yet he isn't even an instructor. These are why there are so many questions being asked about what's actually going on with SAA, and has safety become just another negotiation in terms of cost saving?
Really worrying that you'd have a captain who's got a history still flying and making decisions that put people's lives at risk. So then, Guy, why would he still be there? Who makes the decision to let him go? And why is he getting away with, one would say, gross misconduct when flying passenger airlines?
Well, this is a very hot potato. The reality is that one of the key problems that SAA has had over the last, since the political transformation 25 years ago, is that it has proven extremely difficult to transform the racial mix of the pilot corps. Before SAA went into business rescue, the pilot body was still over 80% white and largely white male. And that has clearly been a failing of SAA to develop previously disadvantaged people into pilots. Our captain, the captain in this case, was Captain Busi Kamala. He's got a good record. Normally, and he's passed all the exams, etc. But SAA has a history of holding on to previously disadvantaged pilots, even if when they do significantly contravene the rules. Another example of this was a pilot who reported for duty at London Heathrow Airport, and the captain believed he was, this was the first officer who reported for duty, the captain believed he was under the influence of liquor, and indeed he went on to fail 2 breathalyzer tests imposed by the British police, and yet he's now just been promoted to captain at SAA. This is why SAA is now being increasingly distrusted by the flying public. The SAA is now one of the very few airlines in the world that is now not promoting pilots based on their experience and on seniority, but on their backgrounds, on their historical background, and dare I say, race groups. It is a concern. It is very necessary for transformation, but it's just one of the reasons why, when an incident like this aircraft flight comes up, it just seems to confirm the narrative that pilot standards are being compromised.
They are being compromised, it would seem, Guy, and that could cost the lives of many people who get on to an SAA flight. God forbid one day something happens. In the immediate term, Guy, what should be happening? Which stakeholder should be getting involved to clean up the misconduct that we are seeing when it comes to SAA's pilots?
The biggest single issue is perceptions. Safety has to be seen as a non-negotiable, if you like, or the number one priority is a better description by the traveling public. Otherwise, they will simply decide to go and fly on another airline, and SAA will never get back to where it was. Even a shadow of its former self, if for the same price people can fly on another airline that they trust more in terms of safety standards. So obviously the first thing is for SAA to get out there and be able to assure the public that safety standards are actually not being compromised. And they also need to put in place what are called SMS, which are safety management systems. These systems are in place, but the concern is that they're not actually being enforced all the way through the line, or exceptions are being made. And as long as there are exceptions being made that ultimately come to see the light of day, there's also a strong claim having been made that SAA tried to cover up this incident with the CAA, and it was only when the Ghanaian authorities raised the issue that the issue came to light. So it's both a matter of perception and making sure that all of these problems are properly dealt with in terms of an absolutely thorough, from top to toe, safety management system that has no exceptions for whatever reason whatsoever. And SAA needs to return to the days of being proactive in its safety management system. SAA was a world leader in pushing what was called loss of control in flight practices into its pilots. They took them on aerobatic courses to tell them how to handle unusual situations. The other airlines around the world took the lead from SAA on that. But now SAA has slipped back into a series of compromises a series of negotiable safety requirements, because also SAA is back to the wall, with finances. It doesn't have a lot of money. So, yeah, this is the problems SAA has to face in terms of perception and in returning standards.
Yeah, I mean, this is a shocking interview that I've just had with you, Guy Leitch, the publisher and editor at Flyer magazine, that SAA could have been was a world leader in safety management systems, and now they are covering up near fatal incidents and apparently a huge problem when it comes to the conduct of some of their captains. Very worrying developments there.